I'm asked in a specifically religious context, I tend to say that I'm polytheist rather than pagan, because the word pagan is used to cover bigger and bigger areas of belief, which have often not a great deal in common with each other, whereas polytheist is a little bit more specific. So I'm learning to use that term to emphasize the fact that I can move in a multitude of gods and goddesses rather than in sort of a universal deity, or indeed, as a lot of people do these days, who treat the gods more as symbolic than not as actual real beings, which, if that's what works for them, well, for me personally, I regard them as real entities with a life of their own and agendas of their own, and that's certainly how I experience them. If I'm asked in terms of not so much the career angle, but how I regard myself generally, I would say a storyteller, first and foremost. Whether it's oral storytelling or written format of storytelling, even indeed standing in front of the classroom trying to convince people about various psychological and sociological theories or notions around criminology and so on, often not these telling the story of how those theories came into being. Really, it's the accounts of people like Freud and Marx and Weber and so on, their story of how the world works. So that even there, when it's meant to be dry as dust academia, there is still a strong element of storytelling going on. Traditionally, from what very, very little we know of the ancient Druids, one of the chief functions they held was as teachers, as well as preservers of story and myth and tradition, law, custom, and culture. And so suddenly that element of being a teacher, both in the paid profession sense, but also I spent a lot of time within the wider baking community, running activities, giving talks, giving seminars and things like that, so that the teaching plays a huge part for me. So that tends to be a significant part of my spiritual life. I suppose some people might not necessarily automatically think of teaching as a spiritual act. It seems a little bit more of an intellectual exercise. But I think if you are trying to convey spiritual notions, part of it is that you mentally try to tune in with the realm of spirit, the gods, the goddesses, and the entities you're talking about, and try to convey that to however many people you're talking to at the time. Whether that's a live face-to-face, or like this, it's a video-based thing, or even indeed writing blog posts and things of that nature, or writing books. You're trying to convey not just dry academic knowledge, but you're trying to convey a sense of the spirit, a sense of vitality. And so for me, teaching, whilst we'll have our bad days, but nothing quite works. At its best, teaching becomes a spiritual act, the nurturing of the soul of the student, trying to inspire them with ideas. So that part of it takes up a huge element of my spirituality. And the telling of stories, again, it's, I put a friend on, well, I haven't seen him for quite a while now, but he used to live not too far away from me in Cambridge, Mark Williams, who is a prominent academic these days in Oxford. And he used to talk about this idea of the gods living through story, that just as fish live in water, birds in the air, so the gods live in the stories. They move through mythology the way a fish moves through water. I just love that idea, and I think to a large extent we kind of all do, not just the gods and grandiose sense, but we meet a new person, we talk to them about our life, our beliefs, what we do, what happened last Thursday, anecdotes of who we are, what we are telling in stories, we become alive through our stories. For me, that understanding that becomes itself a spiritual act of creation, that we are not only becoming ourselves, but we're also enabling others to live where we tell their stories, pass them in a way that they approve of, hopefully. It could awful if they didn't approve of the way we told their stories, but we bring them to life through the power of word, which is as slightly Christian as it did in the beginning was the word. So there is an element of fact. So in the beginning was the story, and the story was the gods. And then go hijacking somebody else's religious beliefs, that shameless. It certainly was an ambition from my early teens onwards. I used to do English was one of my favourite subjects at school. The opportunity to write stories and come up with notions was something that really appealed to me. Very much enjoyed doing. Obviously, didn't publish anything, but just writing for the pleasure of writing at that age. And I did want to become an author at some description. Obviously, the J.K. Rowling stakes are still a hell of a long way off when it comes to revenues and fame and fortune and all the rest of it. But no, that's definitely something I've always wanted to do. My main aim in the teenage years was to be a writer of fiction. So the majority of things I've written nowadays are the factual end rather than the fictional end. So the fictional aspiration is still something I'm trying to expand upon. I've got one particular book with Moon Books, which is a collection of short stories. So that's something I'd love to sort of develop more in the future, as well as doing the more factual things like the books on poetry and Egyptian mythology and rules and so on. So it's been a lifelong pleasure. So the joy of having that first copy, advanced copy of a book in your hands is a rare pleasure. I think most editors, even I'm sure the ones who've churned out hundreds of books, probably still get a thrill every time that first advanced copy arrives through the post. I can see where all of the brain-numbing labour made real on the page. The initial plan was to try and cover as many myths and legends connected to wolves from around the world as possible, but within the word count that proved just impossible because there's just so many of them that what I feel I've done is give people a taster rather than an entire global perspective. So I've focused each of the chapters on a different culture in Greece, Rome, the Far East, the Celts, the Norse, and so forth, and gone into not every single myth within those cultures, because again, there's just so many of them, but try to give people a flavour of how wolves have been understood historically and when we treated, how the mythology often shapes the way in which we treat other living beings, whether we regard them as admirable and noble and worth looking after, or whether we fear them as monsters and see them as something that we need to eradicate. It has a sort of stories have consequences, can put it in that sense. I think perhaps particularly for wolves more so than a lot of other species, because they've been so pushed to the brink of endangerment, both by the changes in the environment, but also by active attempts at what we might well call genocide, or to wipe out wolves from existence in many parts of the world. Japan, they succeeded. They are totally destroyed in the space of very, very few years their entire native population, which is something that does get touched on in one of the chapters in the book. So it's a kind of a survey of cultural flavours and ideas of how wolves are understood. But I've also tried to incorporate a bit of ritual, a bit of spiritual guidance and advice to people who connect either with a wolf deity or just the idea of wolves in general. I think quite a lot of people are very moved by the presence of wolves and the sight of wolves in zoos or films, TV documentaries, that sort of thing. And so I think a lot of people would like to do more than just look at them in the zoo or a safari park. They'd like to make some kind of deeper connection. Also, I've tried to provide some advice and guidance on how people can do that. It's not exactly a magic 101, to do wolf spells or anything quite like that, but steering people through possibilities and options for them to consider. And at some point, if the interest is there, it might be a nice idea to do a follow-up and look at wolves in parts of the world that I didn't get the time or the word count to look at in this edition. So there's very little, for example, about wolves in America, because there's just such an enormous body of native wolf law that would have filled the 60,000 volume by itself without even touching on the European experience or the experience in China, Japan, India, and other parts of the world. So I thought I'd make an executive decision, put America to one side, and maybe at some point in the future there'll be an opportunity to delve into that whole subject in and of itself, that we understand of the various native nations, First Nations, First Nations, of America and their understanding of wolves. At the moment, my regime, I'd love to aspire to Roald Dahl's approach, not to be edited by a bunch of sanctimonious prigs in the future when I'm dead, but he used to have shed, and he'd take himself every single day off to his shed and flask of coffee or tea or whatever it was he preferred, and let himself in for a couple of hours. He'd pound away at the typewriter. I'd love to be able to do that, but don't have a shed. And also, with my work, there are periods of the year when it is absolutely hyper. Every evening, every weekend is given over to the college stuff. So I don't write every single day, and I don't write every single week. But I try to structure it in around the demands of paid employment. I have time when there's no one around, there's no noise, there's no distraction. But I say no, I like to put on music, so I can waft away into the world of instrumental music, not lyrics, because otherwise you end up typing the lyrics by accident, I find. So just into your subconscious. So just instrumental music, classical, jazz, things like that. Get into the zone. With a mountain of books around for research purposes. So even when I'm doing fiction, because a lot of the fiction I write is historically based, there's still got to be double checking of dates and what kind of technology is available in the given century, that sort of thing. Which is perhaps a good incitement to try and write something very modern where I don't have to do all of that make my life infinitely easier. I have written, although I've not published any except in magazines, written various horror short stories, which is a genre I really enjoy as well, the supernatural. And that tends to be more modern day setting rather than historical period settings. So even there is certain amount of research you have to do. So I work out piles of books everywhere around me as I'm working, so I can double check my facts and dates and what have you. So that tends to be my regime, and vast quantities of coffee to try and stay awake and stay focused. But it doesn't do my brain chemistry much good in the long run. But keeps me going, and helps me to plow away. So that tends to be my rather chaotic letting regime. At some point, maybe I'll get much more ordered and instructed in letting regime. Maybe even end up in the Barbara Cartman stakes of churning out 30 books of alphabet. I prefer the live experience. Most of the time, live teaching, live storytelling in similar vein, to engage with an interested audience. There is a connection there that exists in the moment. But I suppose the challenge, no difficulty there is once it's live, once it's gone, it's gone. It's like a mayfly with its existence as a period. And I do know, without naming names, some storytellers who will memorize a script, and every time you see them do a particular story, it is word for word identical. So they're not kind of adapting it to the audience, they're not going with the reaction of the people in the room. It's like an actor reciting Shakespeare or whatever, which to me isn't really what storytelling is. And likewise, I'm going back to my own university days, we had lecturers who would come in with their typed up lecture, which they'd probably been reading for 20 years to class after class after class. And it probably didn't change from one year to the next. They just stood there, read their script, went home, had a cup of tea. Again, to me, that is not what teaching should be. Teaching should be live and in the moment. So yes, there's certain issues you need to cover, this theorist, that theorist, etc. But you cover it in a way that is unique to the class. Writing itself is, for me, a whole other ballgame, because obviously it's more like a flying amber. But once you've committed it to the page, as opposed to the spoken word, it then attains permanence. And absolutely nothing whatsoever wrong in writing it, because if you've written, not that I'm claiming that my writing was marvelous or anything, but if you've got someone who's written a truly beautiful poem or an inspired piece of descriptive prose, it's there for all time for everyone to enjoy. But it is not an interaction with an audience, because even though in your own head you're imagining people reading it, you've got no idea who those people are. Whereas if you're in a class or you're in a room at a storytelling event, you can see them. You know you know who they are after a fashion. So you engage with them in a whole different context. It's the live is fun, but there is there's peace and solitude, I think, in sitting down in front of a word processor all by yourself, away from everyone else, and creating something for a purely imaginary audience, which hopefully will be a good, it's something that people will enjoy reading for years and years and years to come. Which, and I can go back to, which is another thing, students often say they have the opportunity to, whether it comes to essay writing, to go back over their old notes and reread and refresh and remind themselves. Because it's easy to forget things in the heat of the moment, is it not? Those ideas are fiery worth trying to center. And we hold the painter very well with a lot of audience, which is fun in and of itself. Well, I thought about this when you sent me the advanced question, so there's a lot of writers I really do like, but one that really grabs me is M.R. James, Montague James. Partly because I just love ghost stories and spectral stories here, and almost everything I've ever read by him has been short story format. I've never read anything more. I don't think he actually wrote anything, but not all anything is in short story format, as far as I remember. But a lot of it is also set in Suffolk, where I live, because he spent so much time in Suffolk, and he really does capture a sense of landscape. And that's a beauty in his work, that it's not just the people, it's not just the ghosts and the weird things hanging in the background. It's the place itself comes alive and forms part of the drama. And I like in lots of fiction, I find myself increasingly drawn to fiction where you get a real sense of place. And it comes across as a character in itself, the actual environment. I was thinking another writer I quite admire is Ben Horowitz, who does the Rivers of London series, amongst other things he writes as well. But again, having been born and lived many years in London, he really does capture the spirit of London. It comes alive as a character in the books of the different districts of London, where each book and the sequence is set in a slightly different bit of London. And he really gets that feel of a place, and that just really appeals to me. It's the pagan in me or what it is, but to get a real sense that this is a place which has its own presence, its own genius loci, its own essence. It's a character in and of itself. So that's a lot of what appeals to me, and I think James has got a real sense of which is genteelly sinister. There's no chainsaws, there's no axe murders, there's no disembowelments. Horrible things happen, but they're kind of hinted at. So it sort of takes place off stage. You don't get the full guts and gore that you do with a lot of modern horror fiction. And in a similar vein, I really do love the sort of Peter Cushing, Vincent Price, Christopher Lee films I grew up on, where, yes, horrible things happen, but mainly they happened off screen. So you heard a bit of a scream, but you never actually saw it, is it? Whereas obviously the modern horror film, it really is torture porn. It's horribly graphic, a lot of it. And I much prefer the subtleties of the older style rather than the splatter gore of modern film, and quite a lot of fiction, which is just slightly too much for my stomach at any rate at times. Well, the one that leaped to my mind, I'm not sure it really counts as witnessing, because I wouldn't just stand there and watch, would be the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Because I'd want to go back and grab as many scrolls and books as possible and stuff them up my jumper and run out and preserve as much as I possibly could do. I'm a big fan of Doctor Who, having grown up on it, and I'd love to see an episode in which the Doctor goes back to the Library of Alexandria and saves huge numbers of burning books. There's a scene in the end of Name of the Rose, the book, and the film version of it, Sean Connery, by the books by Umberto Eco, on at risk of spoiling it for and sundry. It's set in a monastery, medieval monastery, which is a huge library. And unfortunately, the library catches fire. The main character, our brother William of Baskerville, almost dies in the process of trying to rescue as many books as he can, and I'm having read it first and then seen the film, and I can totally sympathise with him when I do that. I'd be rushing into the flames and dragging out as many of those unique texts as possible to preserve them forever long. So that's where I'd go. So I wouldn't just witness it, or I'd be interfering in exactly the way that time loops are not meant to do. James himself, Emma James would be well. He was a great oral storyteller. He used to read his stories out to his students before he had them published. So I'm sure it'd be a great sort of raconteur and entertain at the table and make him tell us. By candlelight was the porters being passed round at the end of the meal, a ghost story, so I would love that, so he'd definitely be on the list. I'm a huge admirer of Agatha Christie, and I know she's often considered quite corny these days, but she's got a real talent for thumbnail sketches of people. So she can give you a sentence or two and it instantly will read the kind of person she's talking about, and what they're like, and how they behave, and what they'll do. And not many, there's a lot of writers who will spend 3 pages to say what she can say in 2 sentences, and say it far more effectively. Well, that's a real gift, a real talent for that kind of succinctness. And she is, although she did recycle a lot of her plots, and you get the same plot in 2 or 3 of her books. But when she put her mind to it, she'd come up with some really original twists, which many other writers, filmmakers and so on have imitated aimlessly. So she was in there at the ground level and laid that. Plus, of course, she had a great love of archaeology, having second husband was an archaeologist. That would be a fascinating subject to sit and talk with her about her adventures in the Middle East and what they found, and theories about the past and so on. I think my third one would be the only one who's still alive, a chap called Paul Mars, who has various Doctor Who connections for having written some short stories and what having connected with that. But he's got a series of books which I thoroughly enjoy about 2 characters called Brenda and Effie. Brenda is the bride of Frankenstein. If you've seen the old black and white film with Elsa Lanchester, or that huge reveal of the white lightning streams up the side of it. Basically, the premise of the book is that the bride of Frankenstein really did exist. Many decades later in modern setting, she now runs a B&B in Whitby. And endless weird people, half of them vampire and werewolves and sorts of weird stuff, turn up at Whitby. As you might well imagine, it's not just the goth weekends, it's all sorts of other shenanigans that go on. And she's constantly having to sort of police them and rein them in from causing mayhem, and deal with all of these strange, sinister characters, which itself is entertaining. But Mars is I can't remember quite where he was born off the top of my head, but he writes with this very sort of northern style of humour, which appeals to me. He's very earthy, but all of these very kind of gothic characters of vampires and werewolves and so on, chucking in very northern terms of phrase. There's that kind of counterbalance between what you expect and this very human element that comes across to these human as they all try to cope with the weirdnesses of life. And I quite like the idea of how would you actually get on with life if you were a 500-year-old entity and you're trying to fit into ordinary human society and pass without creating too much notice and too much panic whilst you go about your shenanigans. How that would work out is quite an entertaining premise. I've never met him, but I imagine he would be quite an entertaining person still to. Certainly if his books are anything to go by. Not always the case, because sometimes you read a book and you think the author is a certain thing, and then you read one and it's a bit of a just fun. But I'd imagine he is probably quite like the voice he puts into his book, so that I think would make for a very humorous and entertaining evening at the restaurant. The laughs would flow, and we'd have the ghost story from James to sort of end on a spectral note. Keep a notepad, both by the bed if you get startling ideas in the middle of the night, but also to chart, especially if you're writing fiction, chart your characters, your timeline, remember who's who, what they did and where they did it and where they did it. So being able to scribble that all down. I know people these days have electronic notebooks, but I prefer paper it down. It's easier, it's quicker, and it gives you a reference point to come back to. Even if you're writing factual stuff, you can still read back on sketch outline, the skeleton of your chapters. And so having that structure before you sit down and start typing away, that makes life infinitely easier for me. And I tell all my students to keep notes of things, where they found ideas and which book they found their research in, so they can come back to it for essay writing purposes, rather than just relying on memory alone. So that would be my tip, notepadding.